Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. For those who are regular listeners, you know I have been on quite a hiatus for probably about a year. 2024 was a pretty rough year for me personally, and I just took a break from the podcast. I did just want to make one quick note that this interview was pre-recorded many months ago. My apologies to the author for taking so long to get this up, but enjoy. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm joined on the podcast today by J. Reuben Appelman, author of the true crime book While Idaho Slept: The Hunt for Answers in the Murders of Four College Students. Appelman's previous book, a true crime memoir, The Kill Jar, inspired the popular Hulu docuseries Children of the Snow. Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, brother. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. Your new true crime book, While Idaho Slept: The Hunt for Answers in the Murders of Four College Students, is about the killing in November 2022 of four University of Idaho students. First, I just wondered at the outset, in case someone listening has already forgotten the case or somehow just only saw a headline and didn't really follow it, can you take us back to November 2022 and tell us about the initial crime and murder?
Yeah, what happened was in the early morning hours, four University of Idaho students who were living off campus were stabbed to death in their home, and two other roommates were in that home as well and survived. They were not attacked. Police were called to the house around sometime around noon the next day, and discovered the four bodies of the victims, and they had no leads. They had no understanding of who had done this. In the immediate hours after the case, it seemed very clear that this was a stranger slaying, that someone unknown to the victims had entered the residence and murdered them in the middle of the night. And the case just blew up on social media. It was very scary. It sort of spoke to our worst nightmares. Being defenseless in the middle of the night is something that people fear for centuries. Basically, it's why we all sleep with weapons by our beds, so to speak. Some do and some don't, but metaphorically, it's a huge concern for everybody. It speaks to our deepest worries, and the case blew up on social media and in the mainstream media because of that. And little clips about the case received millions and millions of views right away. It was just a very terrifying thing that
Sure.
all eyes in the world were glued on for quite some time.
And can you tell us and remind us kind of the layout of the house? Did the killings happen upstairs? How many apartments were in the house?
Yeah, it's a really interesting house. Many of these off-campus houses in college towns are like this. They're built to maximize space, maximize bedrooms and body count, so to speak. Not necessarily the dead, but you're packed into these houses because landlords tend to make a lot. The more bodies you can fit in the house. So this was a really strange, like six bedroom house, but had an add-on at some point. It was shaped real funky. It's a 3-tiered home built against a little bit of a hillside. So when you're looking at the house from the street, what appears to be the front door what is the front door is actually from the back. It looks like the basement. So from the front of the house, it looks like the first floor of a 3-floor house. If you're looking at the house from the back, it looks like the basement of a house. The main living quarters were actually on the second floor, the kitchen and things like that. So you walk into this kind of strange house. There's a bedroom to either side, but then you have to go up a small stairwell to get to the kitchen and living room. And then you go off to the side. There's another weird stairwell that goes up to a third floor. I describe it as being kind of built like a Jenga stack. You know how there's like wood pieces here and there. That's kind of how the house feels a little bit in layout. And on the bottom floor was one of the roommates who survived. On the second floor was one of the roommates who survived on one side, but on the other side, two of the victims on that second floor, and then on the top floor were two other victims. And what we can assume is that the killer went up to the third floor first, murdered the two victims up there, two young women named Kaylee Gonsalves and Madison Mogan, and on the second floor then went down and murdered the two young victims there, Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle. And there's a lot of details around this, how this happened and everything, but yeah, it was a horrific thing, and I can go into it as deep or shallow leveled as you want, whatever you need.
Sure. Well, for more than a month after the killing in November 2022, the Idaho Police Agency's investigators were working on the case, but from the outside and probably from social media, it didn't appear that they were getting much traction. And then can you tell us what happened the day before New Year's Eve in 2022?
Yeah, this the investigation went on for 5-6 weeks. It's still going on, you could say, as they've arrested a suspect and are building a case against him. But in the initial days, the public sort of went crazy for answers. Hundreds of media personnel from mainstream media, Fox News, CNN, name the big ones, NBC, everybody had somebody in Moscow, which is a little town in North Idaho. Everybody had somebody show up in North Idaho with their cameras and microphones, asking the police for answers. And social media sleuths by the thousands were covering this case. Hundreds of them had descended on the town of Moscow as well. TikTokers and YouTubers and all kinds of social media cyber sleuths. And because of the pressure on the local police department for answers, because everybody was covering this so richly, there was so much content online about this case, and everybody who had content was getting click by click by click, right? And clicks were driving their sort of greed for information, so to speak. And so because they were putting so much pressure on the police to feed their audiences, the police really had no choice but to start giving public press conferences, answering some of the questions people had. Lots of people were pointing at neighbors as the suspects. Lots of people were pointing at friends or associates or even loved ones as the suspects for these murders. And the police had to speak to that as well. They had to sort of publicly say, so-and-so is not a suspect. So-and-so is not a suspect. Because a lot of these so-and-sos were getting harassed online. There were death threats being made against people. I mean, the frenzy for information related to this case was crazy. And so police had to publicly sort of hold the masses at bay and provide very little information, because that's their job as investigators, to hold back the information as much as they can, unless they need something from the public. The reason they hold back whatever information they have is so that they can protect that information and work diligently to find a suspect or to arrest a suspect, so that person doesn't spook. If they go public with everything they have on somebody, right, then those people are going to evade police and things like that. It's also important to keep the information about the crime scene and all that close to their chest, so that you can protect the victims, protect the families of the victims, so that people don't mess with the information in public, get it wrong, start spreading false narratives, things like that. Police have to hold on to the information. What they were holding on to was a lot more than what the public thought they had. The public pretty much thought they had nothing. Well, it turns out they had a pretty decent amount of information. Along the way, in the immediate day, they had discovered that a knife sheath had been left behind at the crime scene. That knife sheath belonged to presumably a K-bar military knife, a Marine issue knife. Ka-BAR is how you spell that. And that type of knife matched the types of wounds that the coroner had seen on the bodies, and so immediately could then assume that the killer had left behind this knife sheath from the knife that he or she used to murder the victims. And on that sheath there was DNA, touch DNA that they had found. And then in subsequent weeks, in subsequent days rather, they then were provided with neighborhood security camera video of a white four-door Hyundai Elantra that had been prowling in the area that night. And right at the time of the murders, more or less, and at the time they weren't exactly sure, but they little by little they were able to pinpoint the time of the murders, and that the Hyundai was in the neighborhood at that time, right near the house. They were further provided with audio clippings from another neighborhood security camera that picked up whimpering in the house. Even though it was an exterior security camera, it picked up whimpering in the murder house, the house where the crimes occurred, because it was so close to that house. It picked up the sound of a thud, which sounded a lot like the head of a body hitting the floor. So they were able to really pinpoint the time of the murders. The other video camera footage of the car led them to understand more about the time of the murders and what possibly they were looking for to find their suspect. That vehicle was then identified at nearby Washington State University's graduate housing complex, and they further then checked cell tower records and cell phone pings related to a person who owned that car at Washington State University, which was just 10-15 minutes away from the murder scene. The cell phone records indicated that, the tower records indicated that person's cell phone, the person who had that car, the cell phone was also in the area at the time of the murders, or had left his residence just before the murders, had returned just after the murders, things like that. So they were gathering a lot of digital evidence, forensic evidence, and all of this led to an end of December arrest that then was made public. The arrest of a young man all the way across the country in the Poconos Mountains of Pennsylvania. He was on Christmas break from Washington State University, and it turns out he was a PhD student in criminology. He was studying the art of committing crimes and cracking crimes, and so, like in many of our deep, dark mythologies, here was what appeared to be the perfect villain, somebody who was an expert in crime, looking to perhaps, in his thinking, perhaps get away with one of the most vicious crimes that area had ever seen. And but they made an arrest. They brought him back to Washington State, then crossed the border back into Idaho, where he has been jailed ever since, awaiting trial for these murders.
Well, from your research, did the intense online speculation about this crime ever endanger the actual investigation?
Yeah, it was crazy. In the first weeks, like I mentioned, thousands of cyber sleuths and hundreds of even mainstream media were sort of, because of the lack of information, they were filling the void with speculation and conjecture. It was shameless, and to some degree, there were mainstream. Some of our largest media outlets had ex-FBI profilers and things like that online, speculating about who could have done it, looking at the neighbors, looking at peers, looking at loved ones. I mean, there were several people who were known associates of the victims who were labeled as the doers of these crimes, and their home addresses were doxed, their social security numbers, their family members, their second homes. Everybody was sort of giving out information about who these people were. What this does is it causes a sort of overflow. There was a tip line. I'll just back up and say there were multiple ways to submit tips online or telephonically. And what this causes is an overflow of tips in based on these false leads. And so somebody has to process those tips. The police really want information from the public when it's good information. But in order to find that good information, they have to wade through everything that comes into them. And in this instance, there were tens of thousands of bogus tips related to people that had been called out by social media sleuths who were just kind of trying to gain clicks on their streams that people were following. So you have YouTubers saying, "Well, I think it was so and so," and just by saying "I think it was so and so," they'll have 1,000 people hounding that person to try to figure out if it's true or not. So the police, and then they were submitting these kind of tips. And so the police have to wade through thousands and thousands of tips in order to find the good stuff. And that requires manpower. Already the Moscow Police Department had a staff of under 40 people. They had to call in the Idaho State Police. They had to call in the FBI. The FBI had to devote dozens of people to this case just to process the tips alone. That's investigators you're taking away from some of the more detailed tasks that they should probably be doing, but you have to have somebody process these tens of thousands of tips. And so resources were just really stressed. The police were doing their work as diligently as possible with a new reality for them, which was that even the chief of police, he's working hard into the night in the local police department, and he's got paparazzi outside with a long lens taking photographs of him through his workspace windows. And that's a really stressful situation to put any police department under, especially a small town police department like Moscow's, which is used to a certain level of courtesy and respect and patience in the processes of their investigations. And I think that they were really adept at not following the wrong leads, really adept at getting out in front of rumors and speculation, trying to help as many people who were falsely accused as possible. But there are still, even now, as we're going into 10, 11 months since the murders, there are still people who are suffering the consequences of being falsely accused from social media mobs and cyber sleuths. There are certain names that I won't even bother naming right here
Sure.
But if you Google that name, and if you're an employer and you're Googling this young recent college grad trying to figure out if you should hire them or not, one of the first things you're going to see is hundreds of links associating them with these murders. And that's a really tough thing for someone who's 23 years old to deal with for the rest of their lives.
Sure. That's kind of unimaginable for most people, especially if it's false. I'm just curious. I mean, you've talked about this intense online speculation that just kind of reached maximum speed almost overnight. Are you aware, did anyone of those people come close to suspecting or naming the eventual suspect before the actual arrest?
No. This is the person they've arrested, Brian Koberger. He has in retrospect has a long history of being a bit of an outsider, a peripheral person that could never really socialize with the flow of the main flow of culturally wherever he was. He had suffered from something called visual snow, which is a neurological condition that causes him to see basically fuzz or static in the world. And there are a lot of other things associated with that. I mean, imagine looking through a filthy window and how you can't really see the outside that well. Imagine if that were your lens constantly, how disrupting that would be to your ability to socialize, to make real connections with people. And he suffered from that apparently, and had a hard time integrating in the world. He also made a lot of women feel uncomfortable. he had for a long time expressed an interest in law enforcement, but he had also expressed an interest in feeling like he was or not an interest, but expressed the feeling that he was a criminal. He mentioned in some of his posts online that he felt like a criminal but hadn't committed a crime, and what that meant to him as a teenager, we can speculate at just the feeling of being so outside, so different, and so unusual. That was sort of the theme of his life, and because of that, not many people were really close to him. So you mentioned, did anybody come close to naming the suspect? Well, he didn't really know a lot of people on a deep level. He had some people that he lived with in his that he didn't live with, that he lived nearby in his graduate housing. He talked to a guy once in a while that lived across the stairwell from him, the outdoor stairwell. He talked to peers once in a while in his criminology and criminal justice program. But he wasn't close to any of them, so nobody really knew what made Bryan Kohberger tick. And he had no criminal record. He had no, that we know of anyway. He had not been arrested for previous violent crimes. He did have previous drug abuse in his life. He was reportedly a heroin addict for a very, very short time in high school and just after high school. He had gotten into drugs in the Poconos, and that's where he was raised, and that's not uncommon in that area. Heroin abuse is very common in some of the rural areas in the Poconos because of the prevalence of drugs like OxyContin that have created addicts out of people who have then turned to cheaper alternatives when they can't get prescription pills. And that's heroin is pretty common in some of those areas. And so he did abuse heroin for a while. He got clean of heroin and he became an athlete of sorts. He was constantly running. He was kickboxing. He was working out a lot. He shed 100 pounds. At some point, he was 100 pounds overweight in high school. That's a lot of overweight for a high school kid. So you can imagine the size he must have been. He's a tall guy too, and so the ability to lose 100 pounds when you're like 16 or something like that, not only is remarkable in its dedication, but also remarks on the size he must have been before he lost that 100 pounds. And so he was an unusual character, somebody who could go from really large for a high school kid to really dedicated, almost overnight, and putting in that kind of hard work that it takes, physically. He had an obsessive personality, and that's what it takes a lot. And that's what it takes to become 300 pounds. That's what it takes to lose 100 of it. It's what it takes to become a heroin addict. It's what it takes to kick heroin. All of those things. And he actually comes from an area where not a lot of high school graduates go to college. So not only did he go to college, but he had gotten accepted into a PhD program all the way across the country and went there by himself. And so this is a really dedicated, smart individual who had a lot of self-determination and stuff, but was also obsessive, and it appears that those obsessions, that dedication, on the one hand, that makes you a solid human being, can also turn you into a really dangerous human being. And it appears that that's what happened. I say appears because he has not been convicted of
Sure.
these murders, but that's what appears happened.
Sure. Well, are you planning to attend the trial if possible?
Yeah, if possible, I'll be there every day. Now, currently it's planned for North Idaho, which is 5 hours from where I'm based. The only way for me to do that would be to go up there and move up there for the duration of the trial. And I'm an independent writer. I'm not working for Time Magazine or CNN or something. So that would be a really costly thing for me to do. But there's a lot of talk of that trial being moved down to Boise, where I'm based, because there's a million or so people down here, and the jury pool is likely to be less biased, and that's what they happen to do often with these small town murder investigations in Idaho, whether it's eastern Idaho or North Idaho. They will often move the trial to the bigger city of Boise so that they can have what they consider to be a fairer trial. If it happens to be moved to Boise, I'll be at that trial every day for sure.
Well, what books, fiction or nonfiction, have you read recently that you enjoyed?
That's a really interesting question. I have been catching up on my reading because I spent 7 months or so, the last 7 months or so, working on this book. Or actually, now it's been 10 months, but I spent 7 months of those 10 months really deep in the throes of it. But I've been reading several nonfiction books. I'll tell you, I recently read a book called Dark Dreams, which, for anybody interested in figuring out something more about how people become killers, or what types of serial killers or mass murderers there are in the world. This Dark Dreams book is an old book, but it's very enlightening. If you're interested in this case, especially if you think, who is this Brian Koberger? If he's the killer of these students, it's really insightful into how people function, how people like Brian Koberger become who they are, and how they function in the day-to-day world. Dark Dreams. But I also read one of his professor's books, How to Catch a Killer. Catherine Ramsland. It was somebody he studied with. But you know what my favorite book of all in the last year is? And I think this is just a beautiful, beautiful book. It's an old one. It's called Townie by Andre Dubus III. And gosh, Townie is just a beautiful memoir of growing up under the sort of the cold, I would say maybe the cold tutelage of his father. It is a really interesting relationship Andre Dubus the third had with his father, Andre, who we call Andre Dubus, but it was really Andre Dubus the second. I don't even know if hopefully I'm not pronouncing Dubus wrong, but I probably am. I've also been looking at a book, Outlaw Ocean, which is another nonfiction book about the shenanigans that happen in the high seas, and of course, I have friends whose books are brilliant. Alan Heathcock's books, 40 and Volt, and Tony Doerr, who's from Boise. I just reread recently his book, All the Light We Cannot See. And I mean, there's a reason that thing was on the bestseller list for like 45 years or whatever the hell. It really like 2 years, or 3, I don't know. But God, just a beautiful book.
That's great.
Yeah.
Where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you and your writing and your latest book, While Idaho Slept?
Yeah. Well, I am on Instagram mostly, Reuben Appelman on Instagram. I mean, I've got a Facebook. I barely use it. Or you can go to my website, jreubenappelman.com. I'm launching a True Crime 101 podcast and course in the next coming up in November, and there's a lot of stuff you can find at my website, but mostly I'm on Instagram, Reuben Appelman. Easy to find. Great. Yeah.
Well, again, we've been speaking to J. Reuben Appelman, author of the true crime book While Idaho Slept, The Hunt for Answers in the Murder of 4 College Students. The book is available now, so go buy a copy. And Jay, thanks for doing this interview.
Oh man, you're great. I really appreciate you. Thanks for talking about this case. I know we're talking about the book, but I really mostly appreciate you talking about the case, because it's a really important one. I hope people pay attention to see what the outcomes are of what happens with Brian Koberger. And just one thing I leave you with is that this thing has made me more than anything appreciate the short time we have here in life. And if anything, I think we don't pay attention to these cases because they're dark. We pay attention to them because it shows us a way to find light, so to speak, to live better and love more and do all the things we can, because these cases really shed light on how short a time we have here.
I think you're right. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your time.
All right, brother. Thank you.
Absolutely.